go ahead and get started. I want to make sure we're respectful of all your time. I know people got to get in and get out sometimes. So welcome back and good afternoon for the Great Decisions Global Topic, Speaker, and Discussion Series. We're excited for week 2 this week. I see a lot of familiar faces from last week, so thank you all for coming back. It's always nice. My name is Aaron Nicely, for anybody that does not know me. And so on behalf of our whole Great Decisions chapter, again, I want to thank you for joining the discussion today. We could not do this without you, and you know, we need that group here. And as I stated last week, we operate this program on a simple premise that we want to set out to be a thoughtful, nonpartisan, and intellectually engaged space for the residents of our community and our whole county to discuss the great decisions and global affairs that are confronting our community, our state, our country, and truthfully the world in the coming years, trying to bring the world down here to William Street. And so this year, as some of you know, we do have a really nice schedule laid out this year. The Foreign Policy Association provides that schedule. Feedback there, okay. Provides the schedule to us over the next 8 weeks, including last week. We're going to be covering a lot of topics. Last week we talked about the future of American foreign policy. Today we'll be talking about U.S. China relations and where that's going in the coming year. We'll have talks next week on international climate change cooperation, followed by the evolving leadership of the United States in the global economy, the role of AI in national security, American foreign policy in the Middle East, the future of NATO and European security. And then we'll wrap up on April 11th with a talk on India and its increasing geopolitical role in the world. It'll be a very fascinating talk then as well with a speaker from Kenyon College, one of the first times we've done that in a while. This year we are doing things a little differently, including today. We have 6 invited speakers this year instead of 8. They're going to be from Iowa Wesleyan University, Ohio State University, and Kenyon, as I mentioned. A lot of familiar faces, but also a few new people that are coming to join our conversations, which is kind of exciting. But then we also have 2 weeks like today, where we're going to roll up our sleeves and have some more old-fashioned discussion after watching a video. The Foreign Policy Association creates something called the Master Class Series. For each of the 8 weeks, they produce a roughly 25 to 30-minute video with one of their foreign policy fellows who's a scholar of political science and international relations. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to watch a video and then have discussion for however long people want to stay. If anyone wants, remember we do sell booklets as well. Corinne over here in the red can sell those to you. We do not make a profit. They're at cost, but we provide them if anyone wants them. A hard copy is $35. It's a booklet of 8 essays that correspond to weeks. Or you can also buy it online. There's either a hard copy get mailed to you if you want to do that, or there's a version you can use on phones and tablets and such. So if you're interested in that, they are good read. They're about 8-9 pages each, not bad. A lot of photos, very interesting maps, things that you can see. And it's just kind of a fun companion to our talks. So lastly on this, I want to give a quick special thanks again to our sponsors and our supporters throughout the community, including, as you see on the screen here, the Delaware County District Library. I was stuck on that. The League of Women Voters, Main Street, Delaware, our hosts here at William Street, United Methodist Church, the Willowbrook Christian Communities centers here in town, and countless businesses and organizations throughout the city of Delaware that have been very supportive of us this year and in past years. Things like hanging up posters, allowing them to put table tents on tables, that sort of a thing to kind of generate some buzz. So we really appreciate all of you. Those of you that are part of those organizations, thank you. Okay, so today I'm very excited. If you remember last week we had a special named lecture. We do the same thing this week. Today is the second Great Decisions lecture of our season, and we've dedicated that as the Corinne Lyman, PhD, Great Decisions Honorary Lecture. So wave at Corinne over here. So we initiated this named lecture back in 2023 in recognition of a colleague, Corinne, who has given her heart and soul to this Great Decisions chapter for over 2 decades. She's our former President Emerita, and she's with us today. She's been here every week, every year. She's here as an active member of the committee. She continues to be a very thoughtful and intellectual voice in our discussions in the group, and we're really just thrilled to have her with us. A little about Corinne. For those of you that are not familiar with her, she is a PhD graduate of Johns Hopkins University at the School of Advanced International Studies, which, you know, foreign policy stuff, that's a big deal. She has a bachelor's degree from Swarthmore College, also a big deal. She concluded her career at Ohio Wesleyan as the Kerning-Lobson Professor of Politics and Government after she originally took up that position in, was it 1968? And Corinne, I have to say, I wasn't even born yet. That's awesome. That's a long, wonderful career. She had a nearly 60-year record of professional excellence as a foreign policy practitioner, an academic researcher, and as a mentor to countless students. Beyond Ohio Wesleyan, she also spent several years in the foreign policy circles of Washington, D.C., among a truly impressive who's who of foreign policy leaders back in the 1960s. I encourage you to talk to her about it. She's got some amazing stories. Here closer to home than at Ohio Wesleyan, she also did receive recognition for her teaching expertise as the prestigious Sherwood Dodge Shanklin Teaching Award was given to her not that many years ago. And obviously, Great Decisions has been one of Corinne's long-standing success stories since she really took over the leadership about 2 decades ago, back in the beginning of the 21st century. And she allowed us to carry this group forward. We've been going, as I said last week, over nearly 40 years now in this location with the Great Decisions chapter. And that's just an amazing testament. I'd love to know how many in the country are going as long as we do. I suspect we're near the top. So we owe her a lifelong debt of gratitude for her decades of commitment to advancing public scholarship, democratic discussion, civil discourse, and truly never has the need for that been more essential than it is today. So again, thank you to Corinne. We're so glad to get this lecture. All right, so lastly then, to our main event, I'd like to introduce today's Great Decisions presentation. It's titled Competition, Cold War, or Conflict: Navigating U.S. China Relations in Tense Times. As you know, we often do have speakers. As I said, today we're not going to do that. We're going to be watching a video produced by Dr. Jeffrey S. Morton. He's a professor of political science at Florida Atlantic University, senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Association, and he is the master class person who creates these videos every year. And after that, we will have a discussion. I will have some initial discussion questions up here on the screen to kind of get us going. They're taken from the booklet over there. But at that point, the room is yours. Whatever we want to talk about the role of U.S. and China, that's up to us. You know, it's our group. We can discuss whatever we want there. So we'll have some fun with that. And then lastly, remember last week, if you were here, there's an online national opinion poll. The Great Decisions Organization, Foreign Policy Association, has online where you can go and take kind of a survey of your thoughts on things. They just redid their website yesterday, and the paper version is back available. And so you have 2 options. You can either hold your phone up to the screen or type in an address and take the poll on your own here or at home, but also have a handful of paper copies that you can take and bring back every week if you want. And what the Foreign Policy Association usually likes you to do, fill out the surveys, and then if it's online, it automatically submits. If it's on paper, they like you to mail it back because they tabulate all over our whole country, all of the survey results, and they present those to all of the foreign policy organizations, the White House, the Department of State, Department of Defense, to show what the people out there are saying. It's just one more little piece of the puzzle. So I encourage you to do it. It's obviously optional, everything is, but hopefully you'll do that. It's kind of fun. All right, so let's get started with our video. Any questions for us? All right.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Great Decisions Masterclass. Today's assignment is the most important relationship of the 21st century. These 2 very large, capable countries squaring off one against the other, or perhaps working with each other to jointly manage the international system. One of the questions that we raise is whether or not the Chinese had a preference in the 2024 national election here in the United States. Conventional wisdom is that Xi and the Chinese would be concerned more about Trump and his proposed trade war, high tariffs, than the Democrats. But in reality, Mr. Biden really continued the tariff policy of Mr. Trump against Chinese imports. Additionally, there seems to be a much deeper concern in Beijing about the United States, and that is our growing consensus, even fixation, on the idea that China is, without question, an adversary, one that threatens the American position at the top of the international system, and that a confrontation in the form of a Cold War or possibly even a hot war lies on the horizon.
All of us who have dealt with the Chinese government over the years have bumped up against a deeply held suspicion that the West, led by the United States, seeks to contain China, to isolate China.
Graham Allison just wrote a book about this. Graham says in the last 500 years, we've seen this emerging status quo thing about 20 times. He says, we always manage to get from the old equilibrium, pre-emergence, to the new equilibrium, post-emergence. That's good. The dark plot is that in about 3 out of 4 cases, the way we get from the old to the new equilibrium is through a process that goes by the popular name global war.
We begin by looking at China's evolution over the course of modern world history. If we go back to 1500, we'll see that China, along with several other areas of the world, were considered power centers. They were very large geographically. They were gunpowder empires in the fact that they used crude military force like gunpowder to expand their empires and maintain control over their populations. By the middle of the 19th century, imperialism had arrived in China. The Europeans went in, they broke down the doors, and they dictated terms to a very proud ancient civilization. To this day, Chinese school children learn about this century of humiliation at the hands of the Westerners. By the start of the 21st century, China had reemerged as a major force in world politics, designated as a great power. The 3 major powers since World War II have been the Soviet Union, the United States, and the People's Republic of China, although their trend lines are somewhat different. For the United States, we grew in global power and influence, peaking sometime in the 1990s. When the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union disintegrated, we were the sole remaining great power. We were the dominant force in international affairs, a uniquely American moment. Over the course of these last couple of decades, however, America's influence in the world, our status has been in decline. A good bit of that is self-inflicted wounds, waging wars abroad that were incredibly long, painful, and costly, places like Afghanistan and Iraq, and shying away from the leading role that we have played for previous generations. For the Soviet Union, now Russia, well, it made it through the Cold War era, but the decline was pretty clear by the 1980s. Gorbachev recognized that. He negotiated with the Western world to normalize relations, and things have not gotten better for the Russian Federation. Demographically, it's in steep decline. Geostrategically, it's overextended, and the economy of Russia impresses no one. It's hard to be bullish on Moscow moving forward. And then we have China, today's topic, which made its way through the Cold War largely unscathed, but not growing much in power at all until the arrival of Deng Xiaoping, and then we saw the rise of China to great power status. So yes, trajectory-wise, China is closing in on the United States in a number of basic measures and indicators of power and influence. In fact, some have argued that China is already surpassing us as the largest economy in the world. Here you can see the two, China in red, as a share of global GDP. But for people who followed my lecture series for the past several decades will know, GDP is not my go-to number. I look at GDP a lot like I view cholesterol. It's just a number. There's good GDP and bad GDP, just like with cholesterol. And so building an airplane and selling it on the global market, that's good GDP. That's good economic activity. But when that plane crashes, that's also GDP. Any economic activity goes into the calculation. So it's not just about how large is your GDP, what is the balance between positive GDP, positive economic development and activity, and negative? Building up for a war contributes to the GDP just as waging a war does. We see that reflected in Russia's economic trendline. You'll notice that the invasion of Ukraine in 2022 resulted in massive economic sanctions that undermined the ability of Russia to be competitive. And during those first few years of sanctions, Russia's economy was negative. It was shrinking. And then all of a sudden, we see Russia doing much better. The GDP is up. But is that a good thing? Because that is a war economy. And war economies cannot last forever. It's no different in many ways with China. All of these housing units, for as far as the eye can see, they're new. That's great economic development if someone buys them, lives in them, pays off the mortgage, gets a job, and contributes to the larger economy. But these are called ghost cities for a reason. They're all over China, especially on the seaboard, where the government is simply overdeveloped for the sake of developing. This graph shows you areas where demolition is likely to happen on housing units. There are just far too many of them have been built for far too little demand in the market. Today, some 65 million vacant housing units exist in China. That is not good GDP. So yes, Russia's economy is growing, as is China's. But Russia's is underwritten by the diversion of all economic activity to a war footing. And China's is driven, at least in part, by the billions of dollars the government has poured into the economy, not as a result of market demand, competition, or innovation, but merely as a means of the government juicing the economy. What happens to those two countries when the war ends in Russia and the funds run out? They simply can't pour any more in. You're likely to see rather significant economic declines. Thinking of the United States and the flawed nature of GDP measurements, if we could wave a magic wand and solve any societal problems, we might start with crime, eliminating it, drug abuse, gone, and maybe even the moonshot that Mr. Biden talked about, solving the puzzle of cancer. If we got rid of these three things in our economy, our society, our economy would decline by 7%. And classic economists would be sounding the alarm bell that the American economy is going downward. But these would be incredibly positive developments. We're just taking away really bad economic activity. So comparing China and the United States by GDP, by pure economic activity, I think is a very poor way to gauge the health and well-being of each of these two economies. Let's take a step back and talk a little bit about how great powers compete. After World War II, there were two massively impressive countries, the United States and the Soviet Union, and they were on a collision course. Ideologically, philosophically, societally, and geostrategically, these two were competitors. And in this struggle, it's not surprising that the United States came out on top. China, for much of the Cold War era, from the founding of the Communist Party in 1949, for about 4 decades moving forward, it adhered to that Marxist ideology and the argument that there's an inevitable clash between capitalist and socialist societies. Deng Xiaoping redirected China. They began to work in the same direction as the United States. Not ahead of it, as you see here, but in America's wake. And it was tremendously beneficial for China to do so. Riding in our economic wake allowed it to increase the amount of exports to Western markets, filling its coffers due to the trade imbalances. It created a massive sovereign wealth fund, which is like a national savings account. It can invest in stocks and bonds, gold and resources, real estate abroad, and continue to grow that fund. China, Saudi Arabia, and Norway have the largest of the sovereign wealth funds. Military modernization was undertaken in the 1980s and to this day, giving China a global footprint, and also the confidence to renew its age-old claim over the South China Sea, the islands, reefs, and other areas such as oil deposits found therein. And finally, it's reflective in the Chinese ability to initiate the Belt and Road Initiative. More than $1 trillion offered to foreign countries to build ports, infrastructure, highways, and byways to allow China greater economic access and greater trading potential. All of this because China accepted our leadership and largely adopted our trading mindset. Today, I would say under Xi that China has altered course. It's no longer comfortable swimming in our wake. It feels like it is surpassing us in global influence and importance. It seeks to move away from the dollar-based global economic system. And that leads to the question of whether or not, at some point, these two massive countries will collide, economically or militarily. Maybe a standoff, a new Cold War, as we saw with the Soviets after World War II, or maybe they'll learn to work together and co-manage the international system based on common interests. What is very clear is that these two powers are the most important, and their relationship will define the 21st century. Four very different perspectives on what China is and how the U.S. should handle it in terms of our foreign policy. There are the political realists who argue China has already entered the great power club. It's influential. It defines its interests globally. It has a significant military capability. Demographically, geographically, it's impressive. Treat it with respect as a great power. A policy of containment, similar to that used after World War II with the Soviets, would be needed, finding peace through strength, and jointly managing those areas where there's common agreement. Classic Henry Kissinger. The neocons, very different perspective. They recognize, as we all do, that China is on the rise, a great power indeed. But for them, the alarm bells go off, because the neocons' primary interest is in keeping the United States at the top of the international food chain. So we should adopt instead a policy of degrading China, weakening China, minimizing its impact in the world so that it remains at least a full tier below the U.S. in global stature. Now it is peace through dominance, and war, if necessary, should be waged to prevent China from surpassing the U.S. and taking over the mantle of global leader. Liberal internationalists. They look at things economically, and they recognize China is a pretty significant economy. There's a lot there of interest to us. Our industries relocate to China to take advantage of their labor rates, their lax regulations, export to Asia and beyond. So for them, it's all about trade, opportunities to make a profit in a mutually beneficial relationship. Their idea is peace through interdependence. If the U.S. and China are trading at a very high clip, the cost of war between them goes up exponentially. We rarely go to war with countries where we have a high level of trade. But that trade, according to the liberals, has to be fair. The Chinese cannot keep underwriting their domestic industries and blocking the arrival of American goods. And then we have the America Firsters. They argue that China is undermining the United States, that the hollowing out of America's industrial heartland is a result of international trade and unfair trading policies.
For many years, the United States systematically opened our economy with few conditions. But while we lowered market barriers, other countries didn't open their markets to us.
China has virtually unfettered access to the United States market. They can sell almost anything they want in the United States. It's probably charitable to call the playing field with China uneven. We literally aren't even on the same planet, given how much access they have to our market, how little access we have to their market. And you've got to use some tough love. You've got to use tools like tariffs to change that.
They view economics as a zero-sum game, classic mercantilism. If China wins, by definition we lose, therefore we need to win in the economic battle. And to win, we're going to sanction China. We're going to place taxes or tariffs on their imports, and if necessary, we're willing to wage a trade war against them because the America First crowd believes we can beat China in a trade war. Peace is now through separation, getting away from China, trading less with it, finding our own supply lines that avoid China, and therefore not being in a position where China has leverage over us. And you find that position through self-sufficiency, by creating most everything your society needs here at home, or at a minimum, importing it from allied countries. So these 4 perspectives on China each takes us in a different direction. What we have in the United States is a bipartisan consensus, which is very rare to talk about. We seem to agree on very little, Republicans and Democrats, but on China, there is an agreement in the foreign policy establishment and among the American public that China is acting aggressively. And as such, it is a growing threat to America's strategic interests. So let's take a look at this aggressive behavior by China. The military is growing, a pretty remarkable uptick in the quantity and the quality of China's military. It has a very large navy, the Air Force is growing quickly, and an extraordinarily large grounded army. It may not have the best quality because it's not a battle-tested military, but the numbers are undeniable. Pressure that Beijing puts on Taipei. Taiwan, of course, is across the Formosa Strait. It's where the Republic of China resides, and it is claimed by mainland China. Thirdly, claims to the South China Sea over all of those islands and oil deposits. And finally, China is competing for allies. There are bidding wars happening from the Pacific to the Caribbean and well beyond between China and the United States. We win some, we lose some, but it concerns observers that China is competing with the United States in global popularity. The question is this really aggressive behavior? I mean, you could certainly reach that conclusion. When I view these activities, I say that's really quite normal. It's expected of a great power. I mean, how else does a great power behave? And I'm most concerned of these 4 of China's claims over the South China Sea. And it's not because, life ends if China controls that area, but rather this strikes at a core American global rule that we developed in 1945, the Pax Americana Order. We talked in a recent lecture about Bretton Woods in 1944 and the free trade regime. Well, that was one of 3 cornerstone rules that essentially have clarified, simplified, and stabilized the global system since the Second World War. One principle is sovereign integrity. Nation states enjoy control over their territory, and no nation has the right to take it away. Free trade, and finally open sea lanes for international travel and commerce. These are the 3 anchors. The United States is beginning to attack the free trade regime. As we saw in the previous lecture, we've lost confidence that trade can be truly fair, so we're taking steps away from it. Russia's invasion of Ukraine 3 years ago, and of course its annexation of Crimea before that, direct assaults on the sovereign integrity principle. And China is attacking the sea lanes because it's claiming sovereignty over a vast amount of sea where a great deal of the international trade and traffic flows through. Here you can see China's South China Sea claims, extensive, all of that area shaded in red. Generally speaking, the American rule is that each country has a 12-mile maritime boundary that is its sovereign domain. Beyond that, each country enjoys 200 miles of exclusive economic zone. Unless, of course, these zones run into the zone of another country, then they have to split them in half. But as you'll note from this graph, China's claims extend far beyond 12 or 200 miles, and they're actually claiming these areas as sovereign domain, meaning no one can enter them without the permission of China. We should note this is not necessarily a communist policy. This dates back more than a century. From the founding of the Republic of China on the mainland, there's been this extensive claim to the seas around it. But it does threaten the American global rules-based order system. It is a direct threat to Pax Americana, and for that reason we must resist the Chinese, undermine their argument that they have a legitimate claim to vast amounts of the China Sea.
The Chinese see it as, well, you Americans, after consolidating your continental landmass at the end of the 19th century, went on to strategically dominate the Caribbean, the greater Caribbean. So these seas are our Caribbean. Why should we be any different than you?
When China is told that it has been aggressive, its answer is that no, China has showed extraordinary restraint.
How about the Taiwan question? It's where everyone goes in almost any discussion of China. If there is ever to be a war between the United States and China, and of course we've been there before, 1950 to 1953 on the Korean Peninsula, it is likely preceded by a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. So the question becomes, what would cause the Chinese to invade Taiwan? I think it's a pretty obvious answer: a Taiwanese declaration of independence. If Taiwan declares independence, not as the ROC, Republic of China, but the ROT, Republic of Taiwan, Beijing has little choice but to go in and go in hard. They cannot let the Taiwanese proclaim independence. And so American foreign policy should probably be based, at least in part, on preventing that from happening, making it very clear that this would be unacceptable because it would likely be a prelude to a Chinese invasion of the island and possibly a link and a cause of a U.S. Chinese war.
China has actually shown a great deal of nuance, strategic patience, wisdom here. I would be surprised and very disappointed in Chinese statecraft, which has generally been careful, if Chinese statecraft decided they had to go overly dramatic with regard to Taiwan's status right now.
So the policy moving forward, what are we to do on strategic issues? Well, we can recognize on the spectrum that on one end is a deterred China that does not invade Taiwan for fear of an American response, and on the other end of the spectrum is an invasion of Taiwan by China. In all likelihood, how things unfold is somewhere in between, what we call gray zone attacks, where Beijing takes actions somewhere between war and peace, and they're doing it for political objectives. For example, air and naval exercises all around the island of Taiwan, especially when national elections are underway, cyber attacks on the island, and direct or indirect election interference. These are all designed to intimidate Taiwan and to prevent it from declaring independence. Making public statements, talking about the plans to invade the island by a certain year, these all fall into that category of gray zone attacks and should be interpreted as such. So what do we do? How are we to neutralize the Taiwan issue? First step would be to recommit to the Shanghai Communique of 1972. This is the agreement between Mr. Nixon and the Chinese leader Mao Zedong. To China we say, unification, according to the communique, is by peaceful means. And to the Taiwanese we say, don't even consider talking about independence, much less making a declaration. We should all remember that in 1972, the United States recognized there is but one China, and Taiwan is part of that China. And within a decade's time, we shifted recognition from the island of Taiwan to the mainland of China. So we have hinted in very strong terms to the Chinese that we acknowledge their sovereign rights over Taiwan. We simply remind them they're legally bound to unify by peaceful means. In other words, I'm calling for a change of the power politics game away from the draconian statements and measures that invariably increase the likelihood of war from a zero-sum calculation to a more mutually beneficial one. But of course, Taiwan's not the only issue on the agenda. And with the election of Mr. Trump, there's a lot of talk of increased tariffs, punishments to China for untrade practices, and really a separation of these two economies. You'll see from this graph that Mr. Trump just got started in 2018 with $250 billion worth of sanctions applied to Chinese imports. Left off the table at the time, another nearly $1/3 trillion that could be applied as well. With his re-election, Mr. Trump may well begin to apply those tariffs also. He's even talked about the possibility of a 100% tariff added to all Chinese imports. In favor of such an argument, well, you take the price of any Chinese imported good, add a tariff of 5, 25, 50%, whatever number we decide. That's going to immediately lead to a higher market price for that Chinese good and a reduced interest in Americans in buying it. That signals to American producers they have an opportunity because now they can be competitive. China's been punished with tariffs. A tax has been added to their import. There's opening now to produce a product and show a profit in so doing. And overall, it might lead to more balanced trade between the United States and China. The warning, however, must be considered because China is not likely to just absorb the American tariff policy. It's very likely to retaliate with its own, which means American producers will struggle to export their goods into the Chinese market and may ultimately lead to a trade war between the two countries. I like to think in terms of trend lines and where they're heading. Economically, I see the U.S. and China increasingly placing barriers between each other for cordial and productive economic relations, likely reducing the amount of trade. Having said that, we're not the only games in town. There are lots and lots of other countries out there. Their economies large and small, and so in many ways the race is on for the U.S. to cordon off its portion of the world, countries it's willing to trade freely with, and also gain access to their supply chains, and the Chinese are likely going to do the exact same thing. A few countries, as you can see, are caught between the two. They're going to do their best to play both sides of the line. I can imagine India, Brazil taking such a posture. But likely we're looking at separate supply lines and separate trading systems, perhaps even with separate rules between the U.S. side and the Chinese-led side. Interesting times, no doubt, in the Sino-American relationship. The most important relationship of the century is certainly still unfolding before our eyes. It gives us ample opportunity to debate and discuss how best to handle China geostrategically, economically, and politically. Thank you as always. Stay engaged and make great decisions.
That was interesting. I like that. All right, so let me advance the slide. I'll start over. There we go. All right, so now we can just sort of talk, and have a discussion. There are some leading questions. These are out of the book, but like I said, some sort of basic questions to get us started. Things like, is the United States in a new Cold War with the People's Republic? In what ways does U.S. China strategic competition resemble or differ from the U.S. Soviet Cold War? And most of us in the room probably remember that firsthand. If you're a little younger. But most of us probably lived through that. So it's interesting to think, where are the similarities? So, what we do is we'll just kind of pass the mic around to each other and go from there. Who wants to kick us off?
This morning on NPR, as I was coming in, I listened to that Justin Singh, who is a Chinese billionaire, is behind some of the crypto stuff for President Trump, and his stuff was just dismissed from the Department of Justice, and it makes you a little bit nervous when you're 70. He's a $3 billion backer behind that stuff. It makes you nervous with when you know that he's behind Chinese cryptocurrency, and that's in the thing. So it kind of upsets the balance in my mind on the whole discussion about trading and all the rest of stuff when it's cryptocurrency, because you don't really understand that whole thing. So I don't understand, all the trade stuff could be a balance, but it still is crypto stuff seems like it's up in the air, and it seems like you don't know where that goes from there. So that was just dismissed this week, so it makes you a little bit nervous.
And I admit that's something I generally do not understand either. Crypto, it's a foreign world to me. Anyone else want to chime in on that or other thoughts? Someone want to raise their hand?
Get up front.
And one thing I was thinking about too is the last comment the speaker made there on the videos, the potential with trade war and tariffs and so on. It reminds me so much of the 1930s in many ways, where there was this rise of economic nationalism, protectionist markets and things like that undermines the ability to have compromise and undermines the political ability to have more of that multilateral approach. And so I think it's interesting to think about the political and the economic are always going to be playing off of each other. There, and I'll come back.
I can't help from taking pretty seriously the fact that the population of China is roughly 5 times the population of the United States, and it ain't going down.
And they export a lot of the women. The girls were exported out. There was an export on, so many of the girls were adopted in the United States and were exported out. There was there's certainly more men in China than there were women and stuff, so it makes you a little bit nervous. But the interesting thing last year for this series, they talked about that the universities in China are the top 10 in the world. They said the top 3 are in China, they said last year. And so there's more people in the world going to Chinese universities than there are in the United States and stuff. So I think that's interesting. It's going to upset the balance on education and on the brain drain too, to some degree. So I think that was an interesting balance upset too. So not just military wise.
Our speaker last week pointed out that one big difference between the Chinese and American situation today and between the Cold War with the Soviet Union is that the Soviet Union's economy at that time was very independent of ours, and the current Chinese economy is very intertwined with ours, and that makes it a very, very, very different situation, and I think just in terms of how we deal with it, totally different from the beginning. We can't really take a totally adversarial situation without hurting both countries, and I don't think either country will because of that. And I think that it's important to separate that economic separation in terms of, as we unfortunately seem to be drifting toward this multipolar world, that there's this economic difference between us and the Chinese. There's a more military separation between the West and the Russian, Iranian, North Korean sphere. And then there's the global South situation with the ambiguity of where Brazil and India are. I think we can be, if we try to interpret the present in terms of the past, we're going to be very far off the mark.
You just mentioned about the economic intertwining. I was ordering some travel clothes from Amazon not long ago, and of course I can buy dresses that are fine for my travel for $20, $30. I have like a huge travel wardrobe now because most of the things on Amazon, or many things, are from China, and we like that. we get lots of inexpensive stuff, and I doubt there's anyone in the room that doesn't order from Amazon.
I don't.
And also, well, you should. If one
She's out of the stores that stuff from China.
Yeah, right,
Cheap.
but.
And that's what we like, right?
Yeah. And then also note that our iPhones are made in China by Foxconn. And that's not going away, even though Tim Cook said that Apple would, I think, invest $100 million in making some things, but he's not offering to put iPhones back in the US. And if he did, the price of our iPhones, which are already high, would at least double. One thing we don't talk about, of course, is American labor. Way too expensive, and that, we have gotten used to lots and lots of great prices with lots of products.
Yeah, I was thinking of a couple of intertwining things, one connecting to last week also. The Taiwan question hinges to some degree on how we deal with the Ukraine question. If the United States shows its willingness to back away from supporting Ukraine, for instance, in our European alliances, that gives a signal to China that we're not going to be aggressive or stand up for a place like Taiwan, or at least it's susceptible to that. And the other thing I was going to mention, and kind of goes along with this, is we've been talking, these are all kind of external things we're dealing with here, but the whole situation within our own country and the stability of our government and the way things work and the chaos that is being created in many different ways is also viewed from the outside can be viewed as a real weakness, and also tempt people to other nations like China, perhaps, to take advantage of that for their own purposes. So I think there's an awful lot going on here besides the obvious right here.
Okay, so there's a question I really have, and maybe someone else can answer this for me. In the movie today, he spoke about how, like the one thing we don't want is for Taiwan to express its independence, but it's had de facto independence for years. What is the way to accept the reality of the situation politically with respect to China? Can someone help me with that? Why is mainland China so hell-bent on Taiwan continuing to be part of their country when they've been de facto independent for years?
Image.
Right.
That's something I was thinking about too, is we talked a lot about what is the U.S. grand strategy last week or today. The speaker mentioned it. It's a neocon perspective, America first, more liberal internationalist, more interdependent perspective. The question I think is what is China's long-term strategy? When we talk about very specific things, like, they want to control the South China Sea, they want to maintain that relationship with Taiwan, but I think we tend to focus a lot on, just very immediate things, like what's China going to do here, what's going to do, but I'm wondering, what do they really want, right? With all of these things.
Doesn't Taiwan make about 30% of the entire computer chips in the world?
It might. Yeah, I've heard the numbers, but I think for me, I always wonder, we have this close economic interdependence, although it's separating a little bit, and they are competing with the United States around the world, but then there are certain kind of things that maybe aren't rational, like their focus on Taiwan, right? Maybe there is no rationality to it necessarily, despite the fact that it's been 80 years or whatever. Maybe that's just one of those things, like we wouldn't give up California, right? And I wonder if those kind of little red lines, if those kind of red lines are things that are going to get in the way of rational statecraft over time too, potentially.
We have a lot of contacts with the Philippines on things that approach Taiwan and China and are close to it. And there are other individuals, other countries that are there, so that we have a really powerful influence right close to China.
It's true, there's the geopolitics of it, right? We want to have a potential place for military bases and securing transit routes, securing resource routes. So we have the interest in not giving up certain territorial ties. Sort of like what China in their western regions, right around Xinjiang, they want to give that up because it's a big transit corridor for oil and gas and rare earth elements, things like that. So there are all these different economic, but also political factors. Think about the screen went dark here. I can't barely see it. I don't know what happened to it. What are we on? We've talked about some of these, and even you can see them. One of the questions says, should the U.S. seek regime change? Getting back to that idea of what should our posture be? I think that's an interesting question.
Look on your computer.
Yeah.
You can read it.
Yeah, that's true. Like, what should the U.S. posture be? Should we push to destabilize? Should we push for partnership with China? I think that's an interesting question too. Or is there a strategy that takes a little of all the above?
I didn't understand the politics when the AI came out. Everybody was so taken aback by it a couple weeks ago. Did anybody else understand that? The AI product, software product came out from China that was so much advanced, more advanced than ours was.
Cheaper.
Yeah,
it's cheaper.
Oh, is that what it was? It was so much cheaper?
Yes, it's a real wake-up call.
So, less expensive AI from China.
Over there.
And better. That's a huge problem.
Hi. So talking about what China wants, I think it's world domination, and I'm also concerned about the soft control that China exerts with its forays into Africa, providing aid, substance. As recently, or as far back as 2013, I saw the Chinese government having projects on the island of Dominica that was providing this very poor island nation with material goods and engineering expertise. So I wonder, with the gutting of U.S. AIT, if it provides an opportunity for China to make further forays into areas in which we once gave material, educational, and knowledge support, and provides them with much more opportunity to fill that void.
That is a fascinating question. Someone who's been in the Central America region, I see a lot of that. And I see it in Africa where they kind of judgment-free foreign policy, whereas the U.S. would often tie our foreign policy assistance to commitments to democracy, anti-corruption, human rights needs. That China generally does not. It hasn't always been quite as beneficial for the countries in Africa, for example, that they hope, because a lot of times the Chinese companies come in, they still kind of run everything. But even so, it still brought a lot of development assistance to a lot of these countries. And I know you're right, if we're walking away from a lot of that, it's just opening a huge gap, I think, where China and other countries, but especially China's going to walk right in to the void. That is a concern. Okay. I remember when I was doing field work in Nicaragua years ago, it's been 2009, but you saw billboards all over the place for the the Chinese Development Agency, or what it's called, but they were putting all kinds of money into help develop hospitals and roads and infrastructure. It was alongside Japan and Europeans and the U.S. And that's, I'm sure it's grown more and more.
We left out about Taiwan chips. TSMC, a Taiwanese semiconductor firm, produces nearly 90% of the world's most advanced chips used for AI and quantum computing applications. They were the firm behind all of Apple's custom chips, also supplying CPUs and GPUs for Apple, NVIDIA, Qualcomm, and more. That's a huge deal.
You don't suppose that has anything to do with the massive investment around New Albany to make chips?
Well, also, Intel is now delaying until 2030. That is not a good, Intel's not doing well. That, we put a lot of, the governor was licking their boots, and it's a problem. Not a good.
Okay. All right, well, we happy to keep talking. We are at the top of the hour and a little past. So, any other people have any topics you want to raise, or questions, or discussion points? So, just raise your hand in here. I think a last question I guess to leave on is that the idea from there is like, what is that future? If you go back to the title, right? Conflict, Cold War, or cooperation. I think that is the great decision, if you will, right? What we're going to be facing on both sides of that relationship, and it's obviously part of a much bigger global puzzle involving economics and politics and irrational cultural things and like demonstration effects, like you said, like if the U.S. is abandoning Ukraine, does that send a signal to China that we're not going to be there for Taiwan? Does that tend to make them more aggressive or not? All depends on what their policies are, I suppose. Lots of questions, right? Not any answers yet. So, any other things?
Do the Chinese have nuclear weapons?
Yes. I believe so. It's not advanced, it's stuck. Oh, there it is. Okay, well, any other things? Yeah, they're one of 6 or 7 countries I think that have nuclear weapons. 6 or 7 countries. Like the U.S. Yeah, the large quantity, right? Russia, Russia, China, France, United States, unofficially Israel probably does. Maybe India, Pakistan too, right? North Korea, limited capacity, but it's growing quickly. Iran, near future. All right, well, quick last words. If anybody wants to, we are going to be migrating over still today for lunch and Amadas. You're welcome to join us. We have plenty of room over there, a little back room, so feel free to come and continue the discussion. Again, the national opinion poll, if you want to take care of that on your own, you need to get a hard copy or the online link there, or the QR code if you have a smartphone with you. And then next week, last thing, international climate cooperation in an era of geopolitical turmoil with Dr. Lori Henderson from our own community here, Ohio Wesleyan University. She's a frequent contributor to our series. We're not going to be recording next week, but she'll be here talking all about the latest in the international political realm of climate change. So very timely, once again, as we pulled out again of the Paris Agreement. So, the video there. All right, well, thank you all. Hey, it's been really nice. I like this session. So let us know. I'm just out a survey. If you like a discussion like this, we want to try to do more of that. Even with speakers, we're hoping to cut back on the length of the speakers a little so we can have more discussion too. It's kind of fun. Great. All right. Thanks, everybody.